Fallout 4's Institute serves as the main antagonist of the game. They're a high-tech science community living out of a pristine underground shelter. Using their army of synthetic humanoids, they're able to sow chaos and distrust among the people of the Commonwealth in order to further advance their goals. However, I do believe that the Institute is quite far from being one of Fallout's best antagonists. In fact, I think the Institute kinda sucks. Let's talk about it. Player agency. The first big reason why the Institute kinda sucks as a villain in Fallout 4 is related to player agency. How we, the player, are able to interact with the faction and shape the game's world. By the start of Fallout 4, much of the Commonwealth is terrified of the threat of the Institute. Communities and settlements have very little interaction with one another. Larger towns like Diamond City, Goodneighbor, and Covenant mostly keep to themselves. Smaller settlements like the Slog and Warwick Homestead have become self-reliant and sustainable. False accusations of synth replacement run rampant, with one example being Kyle from Diamond City accusing his brother of being a synth. And an attempt at starting a provisional government has been thwarted already. One of Nick Valentine's dialogue discusses the massacre of the CPG, stating that a synth sent by the Institute killed every representative at a meeting. All this means is that the Institute are clearly established as the most powerful faction, dominating the Commonwealth's interfactional conflict. Now, in any game, the tough part about letting the player join the bad guys faction is that for your character to be seen as the big player within the world, they need to make a significant change within the game's world. Change that couldn't be made without your help. But in Fallout 4, you come into a world where the Minutemen have been all but destroyed, Preston Garvey's group is all that remains after the Quincy massacre, the railroad is nothing but a rumor, especially after the previous base at the switchboard had been raided and many railroad agents were killed, and the Brotherhood are in a new and hostile territory. Several past scout teams have either been declared KIA or MIA. This leaves the Boogeyman Institute at the top of the faction food chain. This pre-existing dominance of the Institute means that when players choose to side with them, it can feel as though their contributions are less impactful. Sure, they do send you on some important tasks that are crucial to the Institute winning the war for the Commonwealth, like attacking the railroad and blowing up the Pridwin, but you can't help but feel as though this work would have gotten done with or without your help. They have an army of easily replaceable robots that can just remotely teleport into combat areas. I don't think they really need some guy who was a frozen TV dinner only weeks prior. And what this results in is a diminished sense of agency for the player. Unlike other factions where the player's actions can dramatically alter the faction's standing, leading to a resurgence for them, joining the Institute feels more like just keeping the status quo. The player joins the already dominant group, rather than becoming the catalyst that radically changes the power dynamics of the Commonwealth. This lack of transformative influence can make the player's journey with the Institute feel a lot less satisfying and engaging compared to the other factions. I mean, it is the only ending where you don't get to push the big red button and turn the CIT ruins into a crater. Weak presence and impact. Somewhat related to the last point, a second major criticism of the Institute and why they kinda suck is their weak presence and impact on the game world, notably the early game. Unlike other factions, the Institute does not have a strong or particularly noticeable presence until the player directly interacts with them in the third act of the game after building the teleporter. This makes them feel more fantastical and mythical than an actual threat for the people of the Commonwealth. At the beginning of Fallout 4, players are quickly introduced to the three main factions of the game. We're introduced to the Minutemen when we help them at the Museum of Freedom. Later on the way to Diamond City, players will typically run into Paladin Dance's team and can help them at the Cambridge police station. and then later they will receive a quest that tells them to follow the Freedom Trail, leading them to being introduced to the railroad. And all this can be done prior to confronting Kellogg, the game's first Institute representative. The three main factions are active in the world, and their presence can be felt through side quests, radiant quests, and random encounters in the world. We can see how these groups operate, join them in some missions, and get a feel for what sorts of people are part of the faction. We start to get a feel for which faction we can relate to the most, and which ones we tend to agree with in terms of morals and objectives. In contrast, the Institute operates entirely from the shadows, and most of what the player knows about them comes from rumors or second-hand accounts. We never have that early encounter that gives us a glimpse into how the group works and provides some inclination as to why we might want to work with them. Sure, if we go to some locations, like University Point, we might run into some Institute synths, or at least the remnants of a settlement after the Institute tore it down, but that's as far as our early Institute interactions go. This lack of direct engagement can make the Institute feel distant and less impactful as an antagonist. If we compare this with another Fallout antagonist, Caesar's Legion, we get to see a great example of an antagonistic reveal in the first 15 minutes of the game. As we take a detour towards the New Vegas Strip, we come upon the aftermath of the Nipton Massacre. And not only that, but we get to have a conversation with a Legion representative in Vulpes, ask them firsthand what they're up to, what they represent, and why they did what they did, and are given a quest to do on their behalf. We get to have a fairly impactful encounter with the big bads quite early on. But with the Institute, they're kept in the shadows for almost the entirety of the first act. While their actions, such as replacing people with synths and conducting secret experiments, are indisputably evil, these activities often occur off-screen and away from the player, or are only discovered through some investigation. This indirect approach can reduce the sense of urgency and danger that should accompany the main villain of the game. And then when we finally get access to the Institute, the anticipation that the first two acts builds up can feel a bit anticlimactic to some. The best moment we get is when we speak with Synth Sean, and he has no idea who we are, only for it to be revealed that he's a synth when Father recites a code and the boy shuts down. After that, many of the interactions can feel a bit hollow. For example, right after the interaction with Synth Sean, it's revealed that Father is actually Sean. This should be an impactful and emotional moment, but more times than not, Father comes off as detached and cold, apathetic to the pain and struggles that the sole survivor had to go through to get back their son. Sure, I get it that Sean has had his own life separate from his parents for longer than a life with his parents, but at least show a little sympathy. We should be able to see a troubled Sean, torn between feelings about his past, his relationship with his parents, and his greater role as the Institute's leader. We should be able to see some inner conflict. When confronted about the murder of the player's spouse at the hands of Kellogg, Father simply acknowledges Kellogg's atrocities. And that's the extent of that. It feels hollow. So the Institute's weak early presence and impact, combined with an anticlimactic interaction when we finally get to the Institute, makes them, in my opinion, less effective as the game's villain. But that's not all. Inconsistent morals. I got an email a few months ago asking why I always villainize the Institute. I can't find it in my inbox now, but the person writing to me essentially believed the Institute to be one of Fallout's morally ambiguous villains, and that they're not that bad in the grand scheme of things. And I don't agree. I don't think that the Institute is morally ambiguous. I actually think that they're morally inconsistent. For clarity, according to Merriam-Webster, the definition of moral ambiguity is a lack of certainty about whether something is right or wrong. You can't easily discern whether or not something is good. The Institute often presents itself and describes itself as the pinnacle of human scientific achievement and claims to be working towards the betterment of humanity. Instead, their actions show a clear pattern of unethical behavior that contradicts their claimed intentions. This inconsistency makes them less compelling as a morally ambiguous villain and more awkward as an organization that pretends to be good while engaging in evil practices. For instance, the Institute engages in activities like kidnapping people, likely killing them, and replacing them with synths. They have conducted inhumane experiments with the forced evolutionary virus on alive subjects, creating supermutants, and they have dispatched synths to annihilate entire settlements, as seen in the case of the previously mentioned University Point. These actions clearly do not serve the greater good of humanity, but rather the Institute's self-serving interests. They're not an altruistic, multi-layered faction. They are an entirely self-centered villain. And there's nothing wrong with being a straightforward villain if both the fans and the faction understand and embrace this role. However, leadership within the Institute, particularly Father, often justifies their abhorrent actions as regrettable but necessary. For example, after attacking the Institute and confronting Father on his deathbed, he claims that the player has ruined humanity's best hope for the future. Father views their work as essential for creating a better world for future generations, despite the evident harm they cause in the present. This disconnect between how they see themselves and their actions creates this awkward narrative. While it is expected for villains to engage in evil deeds, the Institute's insistence that they are not evil or that they are working for the greater good sends a mixed message. It undermines their role as villains and makes their moral stance appear inconsistent. The Institute isn't morally ambiguous, they're morally inconsistent. Lack of clear motivation. In a similar vein, the Institute is not only unsure as to where they lie on the morality spectrum, they would also actually appear quite confused as to what their actual endgame is. A question I receive far too often or see on Reddit and the likes is, what are the Institute's goals? And I think it's a valid ask. They don't really make it too clear as to what they want to accomplish in the grand scheme of things. Yes, they claim that they want to better humanity, and their main story quests end when you activate their nuclear generator, but we never really learn what the Institute's perfect future would look like. Unlike other factions in Fallout 4, the Institute does not provide a clear, coherent vision for the future. We learn the motivations of the other factions from doing their quests. We know that the Minutemen aim to protect and rebuild the Commonwealth, the Brotherhood of Steel seeks to preserve technology and eradicate non-human threats, and the Railroad fights for synth freedom. In contrast, the Institute's ultimate objective remains more or less uncertain. They claim to be creating a utopia through technological advancement, but we're never painted a picture of what that would look like. And this lack of clear motivation makes the Institute's actions feel disjointed. For example, their creation of synths is supposedly for the betterment of humanity, yet they use these synths to infiltrate and control the Commonwealth, undermining the little trust and stability that remains. Their scientific pursuits, like the work being done in the bioscience division, could potentially benefit humanity, but are often overshadowed by their unethical practices and authoritarian tactics. And when folks on the surface attempt to bring actual betterment to the Commonwealth through a unified government, they go and slaughter those responsible. This inconsistency can make it difficult to understand what the Institute truly stands for. To me, they just come across as this hyper-advanced underground society that finds joy in toying with surface dwellers. Like, I'm sure no one would care about or fear them if they just quietly lived in their blindingly white base. But alas, time after time, they find themselves sowing distrust and fear amongst the people of the Commonwealth. Additionally, key figures within the Institute, like Father, fail to provide a compelling argument for their actions. He speaks of a grand vision for the future, but provides little concrete evidence of how the Institute's actions will lead to a better world. This makes it so that when the player joins the Institute, they find themselves wondering what exactly they're fighting for. The quests are more about maintaining the Institute's control and dominance over the Commonwealth, and less about bettering the wasteland. We capture a synth from the Libertalia Raiders, we assault Bunker Hill, we slaughter a bunch of Railroad agents and Brotherhood soldiers, and we've got to persuade some guy to join the Institute. That's essentially the cliff notes for the big moves we make while helping them. That sure is a lot of killing for a faction that wants to better humanity. So all in all, without a coherent vision for the future, the Institute's role as the antagonist feels muddled and unconvincing. This makes it difficult to rally to their cause, as if they don't even know what they're doing, how am I supposed to know what I should be doing? And that wraps up about 4 big reasons why I think the Institute kinda sucks. Their motivations are vague and inconsistent, the group lacks a strong immediate presence in the game world, and the faction, notably Father, fails to create a meaningful connection with the player. We're never really given a good reason to join up with them in the first place. Even all the technology in the world can't save the Institute from just kinda sucking. That's all from me today, folks. If you like the video, be sure to share and subscribe, join the Discord, have a good rest of your day. Cheers.
But these people, with their twisted ideology, they seek to undermine everything the Institute stands for. Surely you can see that.
They want freedom for the synths, that's all. They're not a threat to the Institute.
Of course, they claim they're about rights and freedom for synths. But those misguided notions have led to countless acts of violence. Surely you can see that you can no longer work with them. That the time has come to put an end to them, for our sake, for our future.